Picture this moment, because there's a decent chance you've already lived it. It's a Tuesday afternoon, you're at your desk, and on a whim you open your super app just to check. And there it is, that sudden cold drop in your stomach. The number sitting there isn't anywhere near what you assumed it would be. If that feeling is familiar, you're about to find out exactly what put it there, because it almost certainly wasn't bad luck. Here's the genuinely strange thing about retirement shortfalls in this country. They don't only happen to people who made obviously reckless choices. You can work a solid 40-year career, never miss a mortgage repayment, do everything that's supposed to add up to security, and still end up needing to scale back your lifestyle the moment you actually stop working. How does that happen to someone who did everything right on paper? Because there are specific, well-documented traps built into how the system operates, and they catch careful, responsible people just as easily as careless ones. A lot of this comes down to one particular habit: treating your retirement fund the way you treat a parcel left at the front door. Drop it off, don't touch it, assume it'll sort itself out by the time you need it. It's an understandable instinct because the system is deliberately designed to run in the background without demanding constant attention. But that same passivity is exactly what allows these traps to operate undetected for years, sometimes decades, before anyone notices. There's a particular kind of cognitive dissonance a lot of hardworking Australians carry without realizing it, an assumption that steady career progression on its own naturally produces a comfortable retirement. And there's a very real anxiety that surfaces the moment someone actually stops and compares their real trajectory against the lifestyle they're hoping for, only to find the two don't line up. With living costs climbing and economic pressure mounting, passively saving and hoping for the best simply isn't a strategy that holds up the way it might have a generation ago. Here's the core idea worth carrying through everything that follows. Ending up underfunded in retirement isn't bad luck. It's the predictable, almost mathematical outcome of 6 specific psychological and structural traps, each one operating quietly enough that most people never notice until the damage is largely done. Let's start with the trap that shapes how most people judge their own progress in the first place. Here's a habit most people fall into without a second thought: checking how their super balance compares to the national average for their age, and feeling reassured if the numbers are roughly in the same neighborhood. The problem is that average balances get distorted heavily by a relatively small group of people holding disproportionately large amounts. Statistically, that's simply how averages behave when the underlying distribution is uneven. A handful of very high balances can drag the overall average well above what a typical person actually holds. The median, the point where half of people sit above and half sit below, tends to paint a far more honest picture of where an ordinary worker actually stands, and taxation and regulatory data comparing the two consistently shows a wide gap between them across most age brackets. Here's why that gap matters so much psychologically. If you're comparing yourself to the inflated average and feeling roughly fine, you're measuring yourself against a number that was never describing typical Australians in the first place. Feeling average under that comparison doesn't mean you're on track. In a lot of cases, it means you're tracking directly toward the exact shortfall this entire video is trying to help you avoid. Because the median, the number that actually reflects a typical trajectory, usually sits meaningfully below what most people assume average looks like. This is an uncomfortable thing to actually sit with, because it means the reassurance a lot of people have been quietly drawing from casual comparisons was built on a distorted statistic the whole time. But it's also the first necessary step toward an honest self-assessment, because you can't correct a gap you don't know exists. And this particular illusion tends to compound with a second, closely related trap that makes the false sense of security even harder to shake. Here's a belief that quietly underpins a lot of financial complacency: the assumption that mandated employer contributions ticking along in the background will automatically be enough on their own. Standard employer super contributions were structured as a mandatory foundation, not a complete retirement solution. Economic modeling on accumulation curves versus required income replacement rates consistently shows that baseline statutory contributions, calculated as a straightforward percentage of ordinary earnings, tend to fall short of fully funding a comfortable retirement lifestyle when relied on in isolation, particularly because that percentage only grows as fast as your income does, not as fast as your actual future needs are climbing. There's a specific hidden assumption baked into those baseline projections that most people never realize is even there. The maths tends to assume a fairly pristine, uninterrupted full-time career, running continuously from your 20s through to retirement age, without extended breaks, without part-time stretches, without career changes that come with lower pay for a while. For anyone whose actual career doesn't look like that, which, realistically, describes most people at some point, the baseline accumulation simply falls further behind that idealized projection with every deviation. Treating your super as an unmonitored background process isn't laziness. It's a completely reasonable response to a system built specifically to function without requiring day-to-day attention. But reasonable doesn't mean sufficient. Waiting for statutory minimums alone to secure your future is, mathematically, a losing bet, because those minimums were never designed to carry the entire load by themselves. And the next trap on this list often makes that gap even wider without anyone noticing. Here's a question worth actually pausing to answer honestly rather than assuming, do you know what your super is currently invested in? Specifically, most people never make an active choice. They get placed into a default option when they first join a fund, typically described as balanced or structured, to shift gradually over time, and it simply stays that way for years, sometimes for an entire career. These default settings are generally built to reduce exposure to growth assets like shares as people age, shifting toward more conservative holdings like bonds and cash. The reasoning makes sense in principle. In practice, for people still in their prime earning decades with a genuinely long investment horizon ahead of them, that shift often begins earlier than the actual timeline calls for. Regulatory fund performance data comparing default balanced options against higher growth alternatives has repeatedly shown a real, measurable gap over long stretches of time, and that gap compounds far more dramatically than most people intuitively expect. A performance difference of just 1 or 2% annually, sustained across 2 or 3 decades, can translate into a difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time retirement actually arrives, purely because of how compounding behaves. Small annual differences snowball enormously given enough time. If you're still years, possibly decades, away from needing this money, sitting in an overly conservative setting isn't caution, it's quietly paying for a level of protection your actual timeline doesn't require yet. This is genuinely one of the easiest traps on this entire list to check, and one of the most consequential to leave unexamined. But even fixing your investment settings won't help much if a separate, purely behavioral trap is quietly working against you at the same time. Here's a pattern that plays out in almost every working life, and it's worth being honest about rather than glossing over. You get a pay rise, and almost without deciding to, your lifestyle rises right along with it. This pattern is well documented in behavioral research, often described through the concept of hedonic adaptation, the tendency for people to quickly adjust to a new standard of living so that what once felt like a luxury stops registering as one almost as fast as it arrived. It's not a personal failing. It's an extremely common and well-studied feature of how people relate to rising income, and household expenditure data tracking savings rates across income brackets consistently shows this pattern playing out at a population level, not just in isolated cases. The financial cost is that extra income which could have gone toward voluntary contributions or salary sacrifice instead quietly disappears into a slightly nicer car, a marginally bigger home, more frequent takeout, subscriptions that accumulate without much thought, none of which feel excessive individually, but which collectively crowd out exactly the kind of saving behavior that would have compounded meaningfully over the following decades. And the cost of delay here isn't proportional. Because of how compounding works, putting off extra contributions by even 5 years doesn't just cost you 5 years of contributions, it costs you every year of compounding growth those contributions would have generated on top of everything that came after. This connects directly back to that illusion of endless time sitting underneath a lot of financial complacency. It always feels like there's room to start seriously saving once things settle down a little. But the years where that feeling shows up tend to be exactly the years where starting would have mattered most. Here's the trap that's arguably the easiest to fix on this entire list, and yet it's remarkably widespread. Every time someone changes jobs without actively consolidating their super, there's a real chance a brand new account gets opened automatically. Across a career that includes several job changes, which describes most careers at this point, it's entirely common to end up with 2, 3, sometimes several separate accounts, each one quietly charging its own set of administration fees, and in a lot of cases, each one carrying its own bundled insurance policy, deducting premiums in the background without much visibility. Commission reports tracking the financial impact of multiple accounts across the workforce have consistently identified this fragmentation as a genuine, measurable structural leak, not a rare edge case affecting only a small number of people. Small, forgotten balances are particularly exposed here because fees that barely register against a large balance can meaningfully erode a smaller one, sometimes outpacing whatever investment growth that dormant account is actually generating. How many old accounts do you actually have sitting open right now, quietly deducting fees, possibly still paying for insurance cover you no longer need or have simply forgotten about? For most people, answering that honestly requires actually checking, and consolidating down into one well-chosen, actively managed account is one of the simplest, fastest wins available anywhere on this list, an immediate, tangible improvement rather than a distant, theoretical one. Which brings us to the final trap, arguably the one that determines whether everything built across the previous 5 actually survives contact with retirement itself. Here's the trap that ties everything else together, and it's arguably the most consequential of the 6 because it's the one that decides whether decades of careful saving actually translate into a secure, livable retirement. A significant number of people spend their entire working life laser-focused on one single goal, growing the balance, and then arrive at their preservation age having given almost no thought to what happens the moment they actually stop working. How that lump sum converts into an ongoing income stream, how tax-free pension structures function, or how a withdrawal rate should be set to make the money last across an unknown number of years. This blind spot becomes especially dangerous around a concept well documented in actuarial research called sequence of returns risk. It describes how the order of investment returns matters just as much as the average return itself once withdrawals actually begin. A significant market downturn arriving right as someone retires and starts drawing down their balance can cause far more lasting damage than the same downturn happening earlier, while that same money was still growing untouched, even if both scenarios ultimately average out to identical long-run returns. 2 people can experience mathematically identical lifetime returns and end up in completely different financial positions, purely because of when the bad years happen to land relative to when withdrawals started. There's also a genuine psychological shift buried in here that catches a lot of people off guard. After decades of instinctively protecting and growing a balance, suddenly being expected to intentionally spend it down can feel almost unnatural, even reckless, regardless of how sound the underlying plan actually is. Without a clear strategy heading into that transition, that discomfort often leads to either overly cautious underspending that sacrifices quality of life or an anxious ad hoc approach that leaves the portfolio genuinely exposed to exactly the kind of downturn risk proper planning is meant to protect against. Ending up underfunded isn't a permanent life sentence, and it isn't proof that someone did something fundamentally wrong along the way. It's a structural miscalculation built from 6 specific, mostly invisible traps stacking quietly on top of each other, and every single one of them can be corrected the moment it's actually identified. Stop measuring your progress against a distorted average that was never describing typical Australians. Don't assume baseline statutory contributions alone will carry the entire load. Check whether your default investment setting still matches your actual timeline. Notice honestly where lifestyle inflation might be quietly absorbing money that could be compounding instead. Track down and consolidate any old accounts bleeding fees in the background, and build a genuine plan for how all of this actually gets spent, not just how it gets accumulated. Go back to that moment from the very start, sitting at your desk, opening the app, feeling that unexpected drop in your stomach. That reaction wasn't a verdict on your entire financial life. It was simply the moment where paying attention finally became more useful than continuing to look away, and taking control of that number today is genuinely the clearest way to rewrite what happens next. If one of these 6 traps caught you a little off guard, drop a comment and let me know which one. And if this kind of honest, practical financial breakdown is useful to you, subscribe because there's plenty more of this deep dive content still to come.